Hey, great. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name's Drew. Super excited to be back in the lab. Looks a lot better than the last time I was in here. As Angela said, I graduated from the program in spring of 2023, and I've been working with the BC Wildfire. I think I should stay muted.
Yeah.
I've been working with the BC Wildfire Service, kind of like an in-house consulting hygienist almost. I actually work for Canada Wildfire, but all of my time is spent working with BC Wildfire Service on their research and innovation team. So not directly their health and safety team, but they do a number of health-related research projects that I kind of help out with, act as a bit of a subject matter expert, you could say that, as well as do a lot of like the field work and the air sampling and stuff. So I've given a presentation about wildland firefighting through the lens of hygiene a few times now at a few of the AIHA annual general meetings, and I was planning on giving that same presentation, maybe a shortened version of it, here today. But then just a couple days ago, I decided to revise that completely and do something new. So this is going to be kind of informal, and I thought it would be really interesting for the students in the room and online to essentially kind of use some of the frameworks and practices that we learn in class and we have access to as hygienists to look at conducting exposure assessment in this workplace, look at some of the preliminary data that I have from last year, and make some like exposure acceptability judgments on them. I thought it'd be kind of a cool exercise to see it in the real world and kind of go point by point and see that process kind of through. So this is a diagram. Here. This is a diagram from an AIHA textbook called A Strategy for Assessing and Managing Occupational Exposures. This is a really awesome text, highly recommend it. It just kind of reinforces a lot of the same concepts that we learned throughout this program. And it's really great to kind of have it all in one text. This diagram kind of looks through the whole exposure assessment framework, starting with what's called a basic characterization, which is essentially just getting to know the workplace that you're going to work in. Then we have the actual exposure assessment, which is defining your similarly exposed groups, taking your samples, looking at those exposure profiles, ultimately making a judgment on the acceptability of that exposure, typically against an occupational exposure limit, and then applying controls if needed and reassessing continually. So I won't spend too much time on this table, but essentially with the basic characterization process, this would be kind of me in the spring of 2023, trying to learn about this workplace that's really unique and kind of hard to access. And you're trying to really answer, or at least I was trying to answer, three things. So like, what is the work? What are the hazards? And then kind of like a synthesis of those two. How are workers exposed? What are the patterns? What are the frequencies, magnitudes, things like that. So when we ask what is the work, we're trying to figure out, what are the operations, the workforce, what does that look like? How do they divide their labor up? And some of these sources can be site visits. You can look at SOPs that are established in the workplace, documents that break down the organizational structure, worker interviews, field observations, things like that. When we're trying to figure out what the hazards are in the workplace, this is pretty typical stuff. You're looking at EPI studies, tox studies, review articles. I really like the ATSDR toxicological profiles, and then also the data hub at ACGIH's website is a really good source of information. That is the documentation for all of the TLBs, why they're set for what they are, why they are set at what they are, and some of the studies that go into that. And then if you want to find out a bit more about how your workers may be exposed, ultimately this is what we're trying to figure out with our exposure assessment, but there's typically some research out there that can help you kind of structure your thinking and contextualize the workplace a bit. So NIOSH health hazard evaluations are really great. Any sort of published exposure assessment in like journal articles, and then your own workplace observations, the use of directories and instruments, etc. So in the context of wildland firefighting, when we want to answer the question like what is the work, I'll try to do that over the next few slides. I'll probably describe like 70% of the work that's done. It's just too nuanced, too complex to get into all of the different types of wildfire response, all the different types of tasks, etc. So I'm just going to kind of go for the middle bread and butter there. So the workplace is typically a fire line, and all a fire line really is the interface between the kind of burnt area here. This is called the black. This is where fire has previously came through. It has consumed vegetative fuels. It may still be like smoldering, lingering, little bits of flames, but generally it's not going to be like a huge organized flame front because that would just be too hot and too dangerous. And it's the interface between this area, the black, and then the green, which is just unburnt forest fuel. And so the Wildland Firefighters are trying to essentially wrap this perimeter and trace it along all of its little fingers and ebbs and flows. It's really not this organized progression of fire. And the crews are trying to essentially establish a fuel break between the black and the green, where it's this 10-foot wide corridor where there's no vegetation, so the fire can't kind of propagate into the green. And then from that, they lay down a hose, and all of the workers will then essentially just apply water 25, 100 feet into the black. This is just kind of another way to look at it, a nice aerial view. We have the green on the left, we have the black on the right. As you can see in the black, like not all of these trees are being consumed. It really depends on how vigorous and how hot the fire is. And then you have this pretty clear demarcation line right there, and that's the fire line. It looks like this one was actually kind of established on a road, and then it kind of veers off a little bit. And so this is what it looks like kind of from the point of view of like, on the ground. In the middle, we have our fire line, and that's that fuel break that's about 10 feet wide, and they remove all sources of vegetation. On the right, we have the green, and on the left, we would have the black. And then just kind of focusing on the black there and what actually happens in there, that is the vast majority of wildfire suppression efforts. And so this is called mop-up, very generally. On the top, we have 4 pictures here. This is called hosing, wet mop, wet line. I'll be using wet line as the term throughout this presentation. And that's just mop up when we have access to water, and that's generally how fires are mopped up. The task here is to completely saturate every square inch of ground, very, very deep into the duff layer, which can be, I think up in the north, it can be like 6 feet deep of just like pine needles and leaves and twigs and things that can burn. And that's why we need really high-powered hoses, and they need to spend a long time completely saturating the ground. And they'll be focusing on hot spots, like so this individual here, I'll use the mouse, you won't see this individual here is applying water to like a burnt out tree stump, and that would probably take like a full hour of just dumping water into the earth. On the bottom, we have something called dry mopping, and this is the same goal. We're looking to snuff out little bits of heat in the ground, but if there's no access to water, either if it's too far away from the hoses or there's no natural water source nearby and they don't have the capacity to fill a bladder, which is just like a man-made receptacle of water. They'll use that, and they just use their hand tools to basically dig out those hot spots, spread out all of the heat, cover it with some cold dirt, and they just work it with their hands and their hand tools until it's been extinguished. So this is just a little kind of bird's eye schematic of some of the tasks and what it looks like. So you can kind of think of this schematic here as like 10 days into a fire line, so it's very much like a midpoint. There's a lot already going on, and very briefly, I'll kind of go through these tasks so we just have a better idea. So at the start of their deployment, at the start of their day, the crew would work their way down from the helipad here, and they would work their way along this interface between that black area and the green area. Looking at some of the tasks we'll talk about later, so we have up at the top by the helipad here, the pump operator. This is someone who basically just babysits a water pump. Typically doesn't need that much of their direct attention, but they will troubleshoot it, they'll adjust the pressure up or down as needed, they'll refuel it, etc. Then working our way down, we have the people who are doing the wet line. These are the ones with the hoses standing over these hot spots and extinguishing them with a very high pressure hose. Further past them, we'll have individuals working on the hose lay, which is just laying out the hose, preparing it in the wake of the fuel break that is established by chainsaws, which are these folks here, the sawyers and the swampers. The sawyers are just people who operate chainsaws, and the swampers are the people who work right behind them. They pick up what they cut and they throw it into the green area, and that basically makes that hallway where there's no fuel. And then lastly, we just have some patrollers. This is typically everyone will engage in this task at some point. It's often done towards like the end when the wet line's been applied, and then they'll work their way deep into the black, far past where the water can get to, and they'll snuff out anything with their hand tools. This is really important because smoldering bits of hot spots and coals can leave, like embers can fly off, and those can travel great distances and reignite the fire. And so that's a really important kind of last step of securing the line. So another question we want to ask when we're learning about the workplace is kind of like, what is the division of labor? Who does what? How many people are in kind of these groups? And very broadly, I have organized the wildfire response into four groups. So first we have our unit crews. These are what I think of as kind of like our bread and butter when you think of these really large-scale expanded attack fires that last weeks at a time. They'll be given names, they have fire camps, they get on the news. This is where unit crews come in. They will action these fires for 14 days straight. Often they'll be like literally kilometers worth of fire line, and they'll wake up every day and they'll just push that fire line further and further and further, doing all the activities we talked about on the previous slide. Initial attack crews are a little bit different. So these are smaller crews of 4 individuals, and they are retained all around the province. It's split up into about 40 fire zones, and they will be retained on standby in their zones to action any sort of like nascent fires that may have started out the night before. So lightning strikes is a really big one. There's the morning after a big lightning strike kind of cell moves in, I don't know the terminology. The initial attack crews will do a reconnaissance, they'll look at it, and either they will fly into it by helicopter, they'll drive into it, or they'll hike into it, and they will deal with that fire. Maybe it's like 50 meters by 50 meters, something like that, in the case of like 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. Incident management teams are like our management personnel. They operate out of offices, or if the fire is big enough, a fire base, and they are just responsible for the overall management of the fire, but they're not actually really quite on the fire line, and they're not doing any direct suppression. And then lastly, the supporting operational roles. This is kind of just a catch-all term for some single resources, they're called, people who aren't tagged to a crew or an incident management team. They operate within the fire complex area, usually not directly on the line, maybe at base, maybe at staging, which is a bit closer to the fire line. And that's just a bit of a catch-all term. And just to reiterate, the unit crews and initial attack crews, they both do all of the same work that I previously described, just with different durations and frequencies. The unit crews will be attacking these larger fires, and the initial attack crews will be kind of wrapping the perimeter of a much smaller fire. And so this leads me to my first poll question. And I just wanted to ask the room, based on the descriptions of these unit crews, initial attack crews, and the incident management teams, how would you prioritize, if you had to prioritize who to sample, who to further identify exposure for? Okay, we're getting close to a minute, so maybe I'll just call it there. And it looks like answer C, so unit crew, then IA crew, supporting roles, and the IMT. And that is, so that's exactly what I would have said as well. The unit crews and the initial attack crews are definitely the ones that are exposed to the fire line and the smoke and the ash and the dust more than anyone else. And then really the difference between the unit crews and the IA crews are the unit crews will be exposed for far longer. They'll typically have more fire line shifts throughout a season, and they're kind of just deployed with a much higher duration and frequency than the IA crews typically. Okay, so still kind of in this basic characterization phase, now I want to ask the question, what are the hazards? So this is where you look at your literature and some of the other sources we mentioned earlier. And basically, when we're thinking about inhalation hazards, this is the results of the work that I did. We have respirable and fine particulate matter. Most of wildfire smoke, most of it's fine particulate matter, and it's actually PM1 and below, but a lot of the sampling is done with respirable inlets. So they're kind of interchangeable here. Carbon monoxide, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are the class of combustion byproduct chemicals that are carcinogenic, and you can inhale them as well as be absorbed through your skin. We have crystalline silica, which is in the soil, and then we have formaldehyde and benzene, which are gases in wildfire smoke as well. So really quick, keep you on your toes. Poll question 2. Out of the options I've given, because there wasn't like a way to just write in, I would like you to try and prioritize your kind of top 3 hazards based just on the health effects shown on this slide. If there's anything that stands out to you, yeah. Okay, so I won't linger on this one too much longer. Essentially what I was kind of expecting was to not have a whole lot of consensus here. I mean, if you look at some of the health effects, a lot of carcinogen, a lot of carcinogens on the screen, a lot of ALARA substances, and so maybe there's not like a really great way to prioritize, and this is where a lot of like your history, your professional judgment, as we say, would come into play. One thing I would notice, maybe with carbon monoxide, since it's an asphyxiant, you may be a little bit more worried about that one because it has the potential to cause like an acute safety concern, but it looks like PM, silica, CO kind of won out there. Okay, so then kind of pulling this thread further a little bit, I won't look at too much in this table, just kind of the colored numbers, which are the hazard ratios I want to pinpoint. So this was just a pretty like informal capturing of the literature and assessing hazard ratios to the average TWAs reported in the literature for all of these hazards, as well as a hazard ratio for the average maximum. And I just wanted to get a picture of what typical exposure looks like, and then maybe how bad exposure can be. So we see quite a bit of, well, first of all, with our kind of average max, pretty high hazard ratios, particularly, especially for silica and formaldehyde, and then on average still we see, you know, some pretty clearly unacceptable hazard ratios and some a couple hazard ratios above the action limit. And then this brings me to my third poll question, which now that we have access to some hazard ratios and we can maybe prioritize based on those, which 3 hazards would you select to prioritize for exposure assessment? Let me pull this away so we can all see still. Let's do that. And for a lot of these like prioritization questions, like I don't expect, or I'm not trying to get at like the specific correct answer. I just thought it would be an interesting exercise to see what people think and get you thinking about some of the information you have access to when you are trying to prioritize. Okay, so it's been about 45 seconds. Maybe I'll just kind of cut it there. So silica, formaldehyde, and PM. What was that? Yeah, I think that's a pretty strong answer. The silica hazard ratios and the formaldehyde hazard ratios are quite high. And the PM, this one's a bit difficult. That OEL I listed there is a proposed OEL. It's not an actual occupational exposure limit. I won't quite get into that. Maybe in our discussion period we can talk about it. But we do know, generally speaking, wildfire smoke, the biggest kind of health hazard of concern in terms of chronic disease is that fine particulate, or in this case, respirable particulate matter. Okay, so these are the hazards that I sampled in 2024, and that I'll kind of be talking about for the rest of this presentation. This is kind of where the work that I did, and that I'll be presenting on, veers a little bit away from the framework for exposure assessments, because these were not, these hazards weren't chosen based on like a compliance strategy or even like a comprehensive strategy where I'm trying to find the most hazardous and the most abundant exposures. There was a bunch of other kind of considerations for choosing these that I'll kind of talk about real quick here. So first, respirable PM, carbon monoxide, and silica. These are all pretty, first of all, cheap, and they're also really easy to sample. And the fire line is very extreme, dangerous, remote, hard to get to, and so just trying to streamline the already difficult act of just being on the fire line with very simple sampling apparatus is definitely a plus. PM and CO are the most frequently sampled hazards on the fire line in the literature, which, I mean, you could make the argument that they don't need to be sampled as much because they've been sampled so much, but BC Wildfire was pretty keenly interested to compare how we fight fire in BC, our unique environmental conditions, the way we fight fire, and compare it with the data that is seen in the States and in Australia, et cetera. This one's a bit of an esoteric one I won't linger too much on, but PM and CO, there's a little bit of evidence out there to suggest that there is a consistent and useful correlation between these two. And if indeed that particulate matter in smoke is one of the kind of big drivers for chronic disease, that's what we want to put a lot of our interest and labor into sampling, but it's a lot more difficult. You have to do integrated sampling, send it to the lab. You can use, I guess, particle monitors, but those have their own limitations as well. Whereas CO is super easy. CO monitors are relatively cheap, they're very durable, very hardy, and if it so happens to be the case that we can somewhat accurately measure particulate matter through the surrogate of CO, that would be a really big bonus for us. So this was an opportunity to co-locate PM and CO samples and see what that looks like. But then by far and large, the main reason why we chose these hazards were that this exposure assessment, again, not part of a compliance strategy, not really a comprehensive strategy either. It was mostly to support a cardiorespiratory health study that the research and innovation team is partnering with some researchers from the UBC Okanagan campus. And so PM, CO, and Silica all have a cardiorespiratory health impact. And so we wanted to provide some sampling for that study. Okay, so I'll kind of talk a bit now about the exposure assessment section. So, establishing our similar exposure groups, actually collecting those samples, looking at the data we have, characterizing that exposure profile, and then ultimately making a judgment on whether or not we would think that exposure is acceptable. So, if we had infinite money, infinite labor, as hygienists, we would love to assess all workers, all agents on all days, but this is just impossible. So we use SEGs, which I'm sure everyone is aware of, to basically batch these similarly exposed workers in our workplace and apply our assessments to them as a group. And this allows us to be more economical with our time and with our resources. Something that took me a while to really wrap my head around and appreciate is that similar exposure groups they're quite fluid. They can overlap with each other. You can kind of crisscross your data in a bunch of numerous ways, depending on what you think may be the most important determinants of exposure. You can have an SEG that can be further subdivided, or you can combine two SEGs, and you can be continually revising how you break up your workforce depending on the data you receive back. So these are a number of ways that we could kind of divvy up the workforce in trying to establish an SEG. So we could look at it by crew type. We could do unit crew versus initial attack crew. We know they both do pretty similar work, but just different durations, different magnitude, different frequencies. We could look at type of response, which I haven't really talked about too much today. Pretty much everything I've described is an indirect attack response. An indirect attack response is establishing a fire line, not on the fire's edge, but maybe kilometers ahead of the fire because it's just burning so hot that we need to establish that and hope that the fire comes to that line. So that could be one way. Specific fire attended. So if you think that maybe the overriding determinant of what your exposure might be is the characteristics of that specific fire, how hot it's burning, the geography, etc. You could look at it fire by fire. You could look at it by individual fireline tasks. So if you think that the direct task that person is engaged in is one of the most important factors in their exposure, so somebody dumping a bunch of water into a hotspot, standing over it, versus somebody just kind of operating a pump upstream. Those are two examples of how you could split up fireline task. And then you could also look at ambient weather conditions as well. So a big thing here is if there's really good venting, the smoke will just kind of go up into the air and it will disperse. Whereas if there is an atmospheric inversion, which is when a layer of cold air is trapped or a layer of hotter air is trapped under a layer of cold air, something like that. I'm not a meteorologist, but essentially the smoke is concentrated towards the ground and everyone's exposed. This can last kind of overnight. This can be like a diurnal variation, or it can last for weeks at a time. Somebody smarter than me and probably more statistically confident than me could assess all of these variables at the same time. It is really important when you're out there taking field observations to be wary of this and be writing down all the information you have and can think of, so then in the future you can sort of analyze your data. So this brings me to my fourth and final poll question. What do you think would be the best criteria to establish an SEG for wildland firefighters based off of the options on the screen here? Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'll keep it open for a bit longer, but some thoughts here, obviously. Okay, so it's going to depend on the hazards we're talking about, right? So some of them might apply to silica, but might not apply to carbon monoxide, for example. And I would say many of these, if not all of them, are perfectly possible and accurate to split up your workforce. Just kind of depends on doing it and then seeing what you get back. Now, for the rest of this presentation, I will be talking about SEG split up by individual fireline tasks. It looks like type of response got the most. which is probably fair. Especially like for carbon monoxide, wildfire, PM, you're not going to be exposed to too much smoke, but may not make that big of a difference for silica because you're still, digging into the ground, hiking, and being exposed to the dust, regardless of whether you're in a direct attack or indirect attack. Okay, so I'm going to show this figure 3 times over for each of the hazards. So we have silica here. We'll show it again for carbon monoxide and for respirable particulate matter. I'll preface this by saying this is the data I collected last year. In total, we collected 54 samples, but it's split up by quite a bit of tasks. So you have tasks with 1 sample in them, 2 samples. So this is very preliminary data. I'm not presenting any sort of concrete conclusions. I'm just looking at, a relatively like what you would expect kind of level of data to be analyzing as a hygienist. A lot of these have like 3, 4, 5, 6 samples per group, and trying to make some sort of kind of conclusions and analysis from it. So right off the bat, what we see here, well actually let me say first, this figure was generated for me, I did not make it, from a browser-based application called ExpoStats. It was developed by a professor in Montreal called Jerome Levu. If you're not familiar with ExpoStats, I would really highly recommend checking it out and looking into it. It's a tool that's made specifically for analyzing and assessing industrial or occupational hygiene data, and I find it super, super useful to apply a statistical lens to the data I'm looking at without having to open up R, basically. So what we see here, for the most part, and sorry, let me explain what we're looking at. So fireline task on the y-axis, silica TWA on the x-axis, and then that red line is the 10 to 12 hour OEL. So I followed WorkSafe BC's guidelines here where we reduce the exposure limit for a 10 to 12 hour work shift by a factor of 0.5. So that gives us about 12.5 for silica micrograms per cubic meter. And we see a couple things just right off the bat. Lots of samples are over the limit, and a lot of samples are kind of just over, a lot of tasks are overlapping quite a bit. So this, to me, like just kind of a gut look at this. Silica is pretty ubiquitous hazard on the fire line. Lots of different tasks are exposed, and a lot of different tasks are quite overexposed. Some of the ones that stick out to me would be the wet lining task at the top there. First arrow is pointing to, and then the second arrow is pointing to the IA initial attack, direct attack. I won't get into it too much, but essentially you can think of those as quite similar tasks. The IA direct attack has a whole bunch of different actions within it, but one of their main ones is just direct suppression of that fire activity, often with water, but also in mature hand tools. So what we're seeing here is a decent amount of samples for both of those tasks and quite a bit above the OEL, so kind of gut feelings off the bat that's a little bit concerning. And why these would be so high for silica is really just that these hoses that they use to suppress the fire activity are very, very high pressure and take up a lot of dust. So in both of those pictures, that is just nothing but dust, that's not smoke. And they're basically just doing that task if they're assigned to be on hose for the day for the full 10, 12 hours they're on the fire line. So you can imagine it's incredibly dusty and they're inhaling that dust pretty much throughout the entire day. Additionally, we have some tasks, so going from top to bottom, following these arrows, we have patrol, we have the hose lay tasks, and then we have danger tree falling, that's DTF, and danger tree assessing, that's DTA. I haven't talked about those before. We only have 1 sample in them, but they were both over the limit. These folks work, 2 of them work together, and they hike through the black area far ahead of the rest of the crew to assess for dangerous trees that may fall down, and either flag them as no work zones or cut them down. So it's very dusty because they're hiking through the black, where a fire came through, so there's pretty much no moisture in the ground, so it's really easy to liberate soil. Same goes for folks doing patrol. Now, hose lay, this is an interesting one to me. I wouldn't have expected hose lay to be that high exposure. I mean, we see almost all of our samples are above the OEL, and we can even see one of them here is over 100 micrograms per cubic meter, so 10 times the OEL. And this is kind of a good example of when the way you're looking at your data is just doesn't give you enough information. So the hose lay task, to remind everyone, they just lay out a hose ahead of the wet liners so then they can attach their hoses from that, and the water delivery system can get propagated down the fire line. I wouldn't have expected this to be a super dusty task, but it just so happened to turn out that the majority of our samples, so the 5 here that are above the occupational exposure limit, were taken on a fire that looked like this. And so this was an indirect fire. This was folks who were working on what's called a dozer guard. So a bulldozer literally just bulldozes its way through the forest. and creates a fire line, which you can see there. And it was just immensely gusty. They were hiking back and forth through here all day long, running hose and testing the water delivery system. And so the exposure to silica was quite high. So this table is just kind of the numbers that underlie the figure that we looked at. And when you hear the term defining the exposure profile or characterizing the exposure profile, this is kind of what we're talking about. So as we're all aware, we can expect hygiene data to be log normally distributed, which has that right tail. And when we're trying to define an exposure profile for an SEG, we're asking a few questions. So one, we'd like to know some measure of central tendency. So up on the screen here, I have the arithmetic mean, that's AM, and then I have the 95 upper confidence limit of the arithmetic mean. We'd like to know the variability, so that's the geometric standard deviation there. And then kind of ideally, we'd also like to know some sort of metric for the upper tail. The AIHA recommends using the 95th percentile. I didn't include that here just to keep this table a bit smaller and a bit neater. I chose the 95th upper confidence limit of the arithmetic mean for us to make our acceptability judgments by. That was our decision statistic is what we call it, because if you look into the WorkSafe guidelines, that's how they determine exposure, compliance with exposure limits. So I thought that would be just a good one to show for the class. And so what we're seeing here, if we just take like one of these SUGs, for example, so for example, that hose lay, so we had 6 samples, so not a whole lot of samples, but enough that we can at least start to make some decisions or analyses about. It has quite a high geometric standard deviation at 3.3. The AIHA recommends to use 3 as a cut point, and anything above it to maybe redefine your SUG. You might have multiple in there, but even like just under 3 is still kind of high. Like ideally you want it probably closer to 2. So I've highlighted some of these borderline SEGs. So we see that this is quite a variable SEG and it's quite a high exposure SEG. So on average, the arithmetic mean is way higher than the OEL, which down here is 12.5. And then the 95th upper confidence limit is 240. So that's 20 times the OEL. So that's very, very high. Now, what I would expect as we take more samples from hose lay, and maybe we break it out into 2 different SEGs, maybe like hose lay on a dozer guard, which is what we saw, and then hose lay on a hand guard. That those, not only for each of them, the GSD will get smaller, but the hose lay on the dozer guard may remain that high, whereas the hose lay on a hand guard may be quite a bit lower. And that would be really nice to do because then we can target our control efforts to the dozer guard maybe, specifically, rather than just the hose lay task itself. In the interest of time, I'll kind of just skip down some of these. I'll look at wet line here. So wet lining, again, is that application of hose of water to the like the smoldering hotspots. It's really kind of like the bread and butter task. We have 12 samples, a really tight variability with the GSD of 2, and then we have quite high average exposure and quite high 95% uncertainty around that exposure as well. So this tells me that the wet lining is probably a good SEG to look at exposure for, at least for silica, and that people engaged in this task are often at high risk of overexposure compared to the OEL. So looking at carbon monoxide now, same figure, we see not as much overlap, maybe a little bit more of an impact by the task you're engaged in, and then also not as much overexposure above the OEL. Some of the tasks we looked at earlier, so wet lining and IA direct attack, they are clustered quite close to the OEL, but they don't quite go over it. And then that is because, if you recall, I showed pictures of how the hoses kick up a lot of dust when we're talking about silica. Now we're talking about carbon monoxide, and you can also see that these tasks are very, very smoky. So as I said, you're standing right over that hotspot in those 3 on the left. They're just kind of right inside of it, dumping water into it. And then on the right here, this is just generally kind of, depends on the fire, but that's how smoky just the edge of the fire is. So doing any task where you're directly on the fire's edge, you're also going to be exposed to a little bit more ambient smoke. The task I've highlighted here, so we have Sawyer, who are people at the top, who are people that use chainsaws. Right below them, we have pump operators, and then down here we have a danger tree faller, so someone who uses a chainsaw. And then this task called Bucker Swamper, it's someone who uses a chainsaw as well. These all have pretty high exposure, getting closer to the OEL, and they're all tasks that are associated with engine exhaust. The pump operator is a pretty neat one to look at. It's kind of similar to the problem we saw with the hose lay and the dozer guard versus not a dozer guard. With pumps, the pump itself is the main source of exposure to carbon monoxide, which is what we're looking at here. You're generally not operating directly on a pump for very long, maybe a few minutes of the day, but the pumps emit an insane amount of carbon monoxide. I've measured 1,000 ppm. My monitor hit the limit, and the IDLH for CO is 1,200 ppm for context. So it's incredibly high. The picture on the left is a mock pump site that I set up with some CO monitors, and we found that in the direction of the exhaust, which is this gray arrow here, this area maybe like 5 meters away just accumulated with CO and remained 350 to 500 parts per million for the full 90-minute trial, which is kind of crazy. This picture here is not a mock pump. This was a real pump site, and it's kind of in this low-lying area. It's by a creek bed. There's a lot of duff layer, a lot of rocks, a lot of just like material that is kind of almost making this like a pseudo confined space almost, where carbon monoxide can accumulate because it mixes quite readily with air. So if there's not a lot of air ventilation, then the CO can accumulate. And then obviously from chainsaw use as well. And I guess the one thing I wanted to say on that pump piece is that if we look here, we have like some clustering of almost no exposure and then clustering of quite a bit more exposure to CO. And so this is likely a situation where we need to divide up that SEG further and maybe do like a pump operator in a high-risk pump site and define what that is, and then a pump operator in a low-risk pump site and define what that is. Because a pump site could be just out in the open field with absolutely no obstruction to airflow. Here for carbon monoxide, we see a little bit of a different story, more variation by task. We see a few of these task SEGs with acceptable exposure, with these green numbers here that are below the kind of action limit. We see with the pump operator, for example, very high GSD. So again, as I mentioned, possibly looking to split that into 2 separate SEGs. And judging by the 95% upper confidence limit of the arithmetic mean, we're overexposed. Similar situation with the Sawyer task. And then down here, looking at wetline, again, quite a number of samples, 12 samples, a low GSD, and some moderate exposure above the action. And then very lastly, this is what we'll look at is just respirable particulate exposure. You can kind of think of this a bit as like a surrogate for smoke exposure as well. And we see that the tasks with direct smoke exposure, so that wetlining task, that IA direct attack, and then this danger tree falling and danger tree assessing tasks, which are like working at the very front of the fire line directly near the smoke in areas that haven't been actioned by water. They're quite smoky. They're all exposed to quite high levels of respirable particulate. And again, just some photos of like doing those tasks and general fire line conditions and how smoky they can get. And then I won't linger on this too long because I've been speaking already for quite a bit, but we see when we're using the 95% upper confidence limit as our decision statistic, we see a lot of overexposures, a lot of exposures above the action limit. Interestingly, we see a lot of geometric standard deviations that are quite acceptable. For our wetlining task, for example, this has been consistently low. This is the lowest it's been, 1.5. So like I feel quite good that this is an appropriate SEG to batch workers in and batch our assessments towards workers conducting that task. Whereas maybe the pump operator is a little bit high here as well. And so what this all kind of gives us is a way to prioritize our thinking and our results and to start to make some decisions either about controls or, at least in my case for now, collecting more data. If you want, which SEGs you think are like quite important to collect more data on, which SEGs are quite important to control. According to the silica hazard, we see overexposure pretty much across the board. Now, a lot of these have 2 samples, 3 samples, and so I'd like to get some more samples before I make any really prescriptive statements about them. But silica seems to be a pretty ubiquitous hazard. CO, a little bit more task dependent, and then PM somewhere kind of in the middle. And then just looking at these, a few of these SEGs a little bit more intimately, kind of what I take from this information. So the wetlining task for all the hazards, we have a nice low geometric standard deviation and a high risk category for silica and respirable PM, but moderate for CO. Pump operator, we have an appropriate SEG for silica, which makes sense because as a pump operator, you're exposed to silica just kind of through hiking. It doesn't really make a difference if the pump site is high risk or low risk. On the flip side, for carbon monoxide, that may make a big difference, and so we may look to split that up, and we may look to split that up for respirable PM too, depending on the inclusion of more samples. And then looking at the patrol task, quite a tight variability around silica and high risk for silica, which makes sense. They're hiking through the black, it's quite dusty. And then carbon monoxide has a high GSD, but a lower risk category. This could be, patrol can happen on as like the end stages of the fire where there may not be a lot of smoke, or it can happen when there's no water delivery. category 2, and so that could be in a smoky area. So that could be one of the ways to split out that the patrol task based on the CO hazard as well. So some of those summaries that I would take from that information there. Okay, so that was about 39 minutes. I went a little bit over time, but hopefully we'll have some time for questions. I recognize that was a lot of information, but I hope that it was helpful, especially to the students in the room. Yeah, I really wanted to provide an example of what this work really looks like, and that we have frameworks and tools available to us that can help kind of guide our thinking. And it's not just like this lawless wasteland when we graduate. So yeah, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for taking a look at my presentation.